Take 5, click. Seriously, I keep trying to get this little clip done, but I keep getting distracted because of all the information here. But basically, what I wanted to show was that we're visiting in on two of my newer systems. They are the African nightcrawlers that came out of this one system. The system reached 300 days of age. We pulled out worms to populate these two new systems. The feedings that are registering over here are really just showing the fact that these bins were pre-built with food. Even before the worms got added, there was one feeding sort of pre-built into the systems. So technically, they were put into bins that were already loaded with their first feeding. This is going to be their second feeding today on day 12. And the other thing that I want to take care of is something that we did a week ago now. We came back after 5 days. We made the assumption that there's still a bunch of stragglers that didn't participate in the haul out and relocation. And we were attempting to haul them out too by getting them to come together so we could do a final haul out of stragglers, bring an end to this once and for all, and then reunite those worms with their families. So that's what we got in a nutshell. Really quick though, before we end here in the spreadsheet, there's also the matter of the worm count. So I figured I'd share really quickly what that turned out to be. Everyone always kicks in their estimates, and what we really ended up estimating was how many worms were being hauled out. So I had to cut that number in half. So what we ended up with was 1,693. And that really ends up being, here we go, it's an average of a whole bunch of different guesses. And even hiding in here, you can see this divided by 2. It kind of wraps around onto the second line, but this divide by 2 is us actually taking the whole number that was split into half, and that was everyone's guesstimates for how many worms were being hauled out of the old system, split in half to start 2 new systems, and those are the worms that we're checking in on now. So I'm going to head down to the wormery, and we're going to get to work on this. So now these are the castings that we hauled our worms out of, and it did seem like we might have not gotten them all, and that was the main reason we thought about trying to do a roundup instead of trying to go crazy picking worms out of finished castings one by one, always knowing you're going to leave a little tiny one behind or whatever. It just seemed more realistic to allow this material to just sit out here exposed to the air and dry, and at the same time set up a really hospitable, cozy spot for the worms to be either attracted to or, you know, whatever the case may be, maybe repelled to. So I'm trying to use both forces here. I'm trying to use the force of repulsion out of the dry stuff, as well as, you know, setting up something really tempting for them over on this edge. But I think the real question here is whether or not the castings are depopulated. If we find worms in here still, and if there's still food in here it doesn't need to be added to, then we could just let it continue as is. So let's make a determination on that now. Furthest away, you might be able to see it from the camera how we had made it really shallow here, so there really wasn't a whole lot of material over here, and it dried out pretty nicely. I mean, it's not dreadfully dry. I can still feel a little bit of dampness and coolness to it. A little bit surprising, you know, considering it's been sitting out here for so long uncovered. So now we're going to kind of start venturing down into the center of the container. Hopefully here too, all we're going to find is castings. I don't know what this is. I thought it was a dead worm at first, but it's some sort of a strand of some sort of material, I guess. Hopefully something that I'll continue to break down over time, so I'll just throw it over onto the other side. At some point, if we really wanted these castings to be beautiful and clean, we could run it through the sifter and get rid of all these little sticks and stems and anything else that's still littering this stuff. But for some people, this might just be considered as a-okay, you know? Use it as is, disregard anything left in it, and assume that over time it'll just continue with the breakdown process, and there'll be really no litter to speak of in a fairly short period of time, just by letting nature take its course. Other times you really want to see if you can fish out any sort of residual chunks of stuff for whatever reason. It's whatever your preference is, but I think both versions work well. It almost seems like if you do leave some stuff in the material, it's almost like you're leaving behind a little bit of nourishment and energy for the, you know, occupants of the material, all the microbes and fungi and whatever else that lives in this beautiful stuff. You know, leaving behind some stuff for that to nourish itself with going forward, as well as some moisture, is always probably a good thing too, to a certain degree. But I believe we've more or less confirmed that there's no worms in this stuff. And we could treat it as a batch of finished castings now. There's no cocoons either, you know, because the way we ran the previous system, the 300-day-old system that we hauled worms out of, was to run the migration for an extremely long period of time, allowing for the hatching of any cocoons in the material and migration of not only, you know, occupant adult worms, but also ones that were hatched out of the cocoons left behind by the worms. Very nice. So let's take this little partition wall. Keep it over here to sort of keep our castings uncontaminated. But what I'm curious of is what kind of a turnout do we get. Sometimes the amount of castings piling up over in the collection area is a telltale as to how many worms you've really got. Because sometimes they're hiding, but you can't hide what they leave behind. And they seem pretty content in this stuff. I gave them a lot of nice material to play around in. Here's even a corn cob. I'm going to let this video run a little bit just so we can observe a little bit of squirming action here, possibly by doing so get ourselves a sense of how many worms actually came together for this fun. And then we can just like grab this entire contents and pull it out. I got to get a container for that too. So let's let these little guys show off for a moment or two. We'll try to get a sense of how many we really got in here, and then I'll be looking for everyone's estimates on how many worms we're hauling out of this material. Alright, I think we've seen enough of that. Let me just make sure we haven't lost any worms attempting to outrun my advances back into the finished castings over here. Hopefully not. Presumably not. Alright. They'll reveal themselves, I guess, if there were any, but I'm going to assume now that we've got a truly depopulated batch of castings here, and everything here is going to go with the wormies to their new home. And I got this nice good sized container. It should all fit in here quite nicely, and we'll no longer really have the need for a partition divider. So since we're feeding two systems, each of them can get a little chunk of that, and maybe we can even try to divvy up what's in here equitably, because I saw there was corn, but I didn't know if there was enough to split evenly into two portions. In case there was only one, we'll do it that way. I see a tube here, a piece of cardboard tube, a piece of cardboard scrap. I got to be careful not to drop wormies into the finished castings, because that stuff's not coming with us. But here's a piece of cardboard tube, another piece of cardboard tube, a piece of cardboard shred, and another piece of cardboard shred. Let's give that to this side. I don't know. And at this point I'm thinking everything else is just my prepared shredded paper and cardboard / leaves mix. And I'm going to also assume that the rest is all just, you know, evenly populated with worms. So if we grab what's on this half, place it in here, and if we grab what's on this half, we place that in here, then we're going to end up with more or less an even split, although one side looks a little bit bigger, so I'll put the rest in there. Oh, we almost lost a wormy there into the finished castings. Let's see if I can clean out all this debris too and not leave it with the finished castings. We'll take it with the wormies into their new home. Kind of nice. These wormies are bringing with them a significant amount of nice castings material. 1,700 or so population in there for the past. They've probably already started to leave behind some castings. Not only that, but these little guys are also bringing with them a good amount of bedding too that they've not yet consumed. Because we did load this thing up with lots and lots of bedding, so there was plenty in here for them to move into. So they could feel quite at home moving out of their finished castings. And at this point, this stuff can go into storage. Like I said, I could screen it if I really wanted to try to omit any little chunks of stuff that's caught up in it. If I do find stuff like that, it always just seems best to keep it with the worms so that they can continue working on it in their new home. But this batch of castings is done, officially. And my spreadsheet will reflect that. All right, let's start to feed our active worm bins. The assortment of foods that they're getting today are corn cob, cantaloupe, and coffee. And it's pure coincidence that they're all things that start with the letter C. And it's pure coincidence that they're all things that are colored yellow. So I've also got my prepared bedding that I spent a little time restocking yesterday. And I've also got some just dry paper we could throw in here. We can even read our horoscope at the same time. Assuming any of us know Spanish. I don't, unfortunately. If it was Hungarian, we'd be fine. Let's get the first of these bins out here and proceed to feeding and worm release. 12 days since we released the worms into these systems. They're relatively new systems. You can see that we opted to just cover up with paper here as well as a coating of leaves. I sure hope that's not a recipe for trouble because, you know, I don't know. It's sort of unprotected from evaporation, although it's been rather humid, and I don't think things drying from evaporation is of great risk right now. I'm starting to see little flying insects in here too. It's been maybe a month and a half, 2 months now since I've sort of weaned myself off of using the BTI in my systems to combat flying insects, but if they're coming back, I'm going to have to whip up another batch of that stuff and start applying it again. But for now, I'm just going to kind of put the topic on watch. But I've got a funny feeling it's time to mix up a fresh batch of BTI and start including it, especially in these new systems. This new system might not have even gotten any ever, you know, and that could be part of the reason the flying insects are finding it easy to, you know, move in here and survive, as opposed to systems that might still have some of that BTI bacteria floating around in them. So I don't know, I started snagging into something and it started uprooting the rest of what was under it, so, you know, sometimes I just use fairly large chunks of bedding in my newer systems, then I'll eventually try to transition to finer stuff that breaks down more quickly. So I'm going to try not to like yank on something and have the whole thing come flying, but I guess my first topic of concern was just the moisture, not knowing what was going on in here. I did my best just to, you know, not satisfy my curiosity and just leave these systems alone until the first official check-in where we can see what's happening in them together. And I'm really glad that that newspaper covering combined, I think, also with all these leaves on top probably helped a lot too to really prevent, you know, moisture from escaping into the air out of the system. Because you could see, I don't know, maybe you can't see, but I could tell just from touching it all, it's very nice and damp and moist. You could probably see just some moisture glistening on a lot of these chunks of paper. So let's just put that stuff right back in there. You also saw some of the food that I used to build the system with. There were some corn cob bits in there. Maybe most of what was used to build the bin was eaten, if it could have been eaten. A corn cob bit will take longer. Who knows how long a piece like this will take to get eaten. It's tough stuff, you know. And the worms definitely like it, but it takes time. So now we're going to, I think we're just going to drop today's feeding right down the middle. So we'll go ahead and excavate. We can explore a little bit further around the rest of the bin. See if we can continue to get that nice vibe that everything's sufficiently moist down in here. Make sure we don't get that feeling like we need to be adding moisture. Because if we have to, we can. I certainly have no objection to that. In fact, I'm almost starting to get that feeling like if we're going to continue with paper coverings, it might make good sense, at least in this early stage of this bin, to add moisture along with the feeding. So I'm going to get my water bottle. Even though I try not to do a lot of moisture injection, just using straight water, I usually try to just make sure I'm using materials that on their own are going to bring moisture with them, like these pieces of cantaloupe. But the rest of this stuff, the coffee grounds, the corn cobs, have virtually no moisture in them. I think a little bit of moisture in here, a little bit of water spray down is going to do the system good. I made use of my spray bottle yesterday, so it should still be pumped up with pressure. So let's see, we're going to grab some of these fresh, unused pieces of newspaper as the foundation for today's feeding. I got 2 of them. So we'll start right out by moistening that paper. Most times I won't bother. And then I'm thinking we could use a lot of this seasoned leafy material that we collected off the top of the system. There's a good bit of that, and it's fairly dry. Figured if we dampen that stuff a little bit, it wouldn't hurt. And it also seemed like a lot of this shredded paper would be beneficial to having it down within the feeding area. Oops. Just sprayed the other end of the table by leaning on the trigger of our little spray bottle here. Yeah, so I think this little addition of moisture can only help. The material, it's got a long ways to go. If stuff gets a little bit muddy or sticky or clumping together due to moisture, there'll be time for recovery on a system this young, brand new system, less than 2 weeks old. So now let's drop in the food that we've allocated for them. We'll drop in everything other than the coffee filter itself. The coffee filter itself we'll use as a marker to show ourselves where we last fed. We're just going to position it on top, right over where the food is getting placed. And then at some point in the future, if we decide to change the location of the feeding, we could just, use that marker to mark exactly where we last fed. Sometimes it's not so obvious when you come back in looking for where you last fed. You have to look around to locate it. So even though it doesn't seem like it's needed, I just like to almost treat it as tradition to include a little bit of supplementary bedding with most feedings. And here, besides that paper, those 2 sheets of paper at the bottom, we're now also throwing in some of this nice shredded paper. That's also a nice material that we could drop the coffee into. The coffee will blend in nicely with that shredded paper. And you know what else I like to drop into the shredded paper? I got some worm chow. I just refilled my worm chow container. I made up a nice batch the other day. It's all kinds of stuff like sunflower seeds or just anything out of my bird seeds, whatever kind of seeds those are. I've got some nuts mixed in here, as well as a little diatomaceous earth to prevent the nuts from sticking, making it all clumpy and gooey like a paste. That works really nicely. And whatever else, anything else I could find that I throw in here. I found some peas, I found some beans, I found some stuff that seemed nice and dry, stuff that seemed like it would blend together into a nice powdery consistency. And that's what my worm chow consists of, the ever-changing recipe, depending on what's available, what's around. Okay, here's a piece of food. Try to jam that down. It's really hard to see worms. You can't really distinguish the worms from the bedding itself. You can hardly distinguish the food from the bedding itself. So hopefully we don't have all kinds of stuff floating out on top here. Well, I don't know. Do we stick with no plastic coverings? Do we just stick with paper? I like that idea. But I guess if it wasn't like stuck to my nose, I would probably forget. We got to release our wormies, right? Here we're just going to go on a leap of faith that we've got an even number of worms on both sides, and we're just going to drop them right in. Let's do it unceremoniously. I want to do it in a way that's also not going to create a big mess. So let's just scoop out half of what's in this box here. We'll see if we can get a slightly better look at them, or at least one last look at them before they squirm into their new home. And like I said, I'm always looking for everyone's guesstimates, and at this point I always try to ask for it formatted one way or another. I do want to have an equal number that I add to each system's population count. So if you give me one number for what's here, it'll go to both. If you give me a combined number, I'll split it in half. Just let me know what you're giving me. So we'll hope that I've not forgotten anything at this point. So I'm looking forward to hearing what people think. And you know what? Our prayers were answered. We were hoping for something additional that we can try to prevent evaporation with a little bit, protect against evaporation. So we were just granted a couple little extra bits of material that could rest right out here over where we put the feeding in to try to block the moisture that's going to kick off that stuff and maybe keep things a little bit more damp right down the middle where the feeding was. So let's get the second bin out here and get them taken care of. Okay, here it is. Bin number 2. Very much the same. We made, great efforts to set these systems up to be very similar to one another. So maybe the other system's paper covering was inherited. That's why it was so much more weathered than this one. This one looks a lot newer, but here too we've got the same sort of covering, and I'm thinking I'm seeing a similar little infestation of flying insects in here. So I do believe BTI is going to have to make a resurgence into my systems, especially these new ones. All my other systems seem to be free of it, but the ones that I created more recently, possibly with no BTI, probably with no BTI, look like they're already starting to show signs of little flying insects trying to move in and take advantage of what's in here, moisture, food, whatever the case may be. They certainly seem to like it. So let's see, we've got a whole bunch of nice bedding material that we've sort of salvaged off the top that we could use as a basis for today's feeding. Here too, I'd like to similarly just assess the moisture level in here. Like I said, they were built in a similar fashion. They were covered the same way. I guess for that reason we're going to continue to find similar bits of food as what we saw. I'm seeing some more insects coming out too. So I'm not going to wait for a video for me to apply BTI to this system. I will be putting it on my to-do list and taking care of it ASAP at this point. I'm convinced that it is going to be needed in here, and it's one of those sooner the better sort of situations. So any of my new systems that might not even have any in it are also going to get a little injection of that stuff. So things look good from a moisture perspective. Nevertheless, we're going to follow suit with what we did in the first system. We're going to add today's feeding, which brings with it probably a little bit of moisture, but not a significant amount. And we're going to be adding those dry sheets of newspaper as sort of a foundation for the feeding too. And then we'll dump in all this dry leafy material that was sitting out on the surface, getting pretty dry from being out there. So all those materials I think will benefit greatly from a little shot of moisture as we apply the food. So let's get that started. Every time I put a piece of dry material in, what's going on in the back of my head is how that material is going to react with the neighboring materials. Is it going to act like a sponge and suck all the moisture out of the neighboring materials? That seems to be what I think, at least in my mind, what would happen if I did nothing. So to try to counteract that, I figured let's just give it the moisture that it's, trying to suck into itself right off the bat, so that it doesn't have to try to get any from the neighboring materials. Okay, very nice. Let's get the feeding in here. Like we did earlier, we're going to preserve the coffee filter to be the way we mark where we last fed. We'll position it right over the feeding area in the middle, and then we'll also have that other nice piece of cardboard to help cover up with in the middle too, to try to make sure that whatever moisture is coming off these foods and from all the worm activity down in there doesn't get lost to evaporation. I'll tell you, with the humidity that we've got these days, I think it's not really a matter of concern in terms of things drying out right now. If it was winter time with my furnace running all the time, or if I had central air and if I was cooling and drying the air constantly, then I could see that happening. But in my case, I've got window mounted air conditioning units if I need them, but I rarely use them. I'm usually okay with just a fan blowing on me. And let's see, we've also got some yummy worm chow to drop in here with the fresh bedding and fresh coffee. And I think that was more or less the way we left it, right? We got things covered up, and before we put down the feeding zone indicator, we released our wormies. Keep reminding myself so I don't just put this thing back up on the shelf before I realize that I've got to release worms into here. Alright, So I guess we could level the top off here, and you know, by doing what we just did here, we've incorporated a good bit of dry material that was out on the surface down into the bin, sort of acting a little bit like a sponge, you know, possibly drawing some moisture into itself and resulting in the entire system getting a little bit drier as a result of that. Hopefully the moisture that we've added as a countermeasure will prevent it from getting a little bit out of control. Maybe we can even, felt to me like somehow we put more into the previous system, so why don't we just drop a little bit more moisture into here. It'll give me a reason to rinse off my glove and leave all these materials down here within the bin, and we can get things covered up. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's feedback on how many worms we're putting in here. So we'll get one more glimpse at what's happening as far as worm release, and hopefully we don't leave any in the container. After I drop them out, I'll make sure we're not leaving anyone behind. Okay, welcome to your new home, wormies. Once again, I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's comments on how many worms we're releasing here today. Alright, so took a few moments there while the worms were getting situated to put a few things away. All we've really got left to do is to cover up. So like we did before, we're going to see what we could do about protecting evaporation from occurring too much down here in the system by sort of layering up some of these top covering papers and cardboards right over the feeding area, where hopefully some of the moisture we're adding in the form of food will stay in place. We'll be able to compare a little bit whether this is helping or not, and hopefully without covering up with plastic we'll be able to maintain moisture levels in these systems. And I think part of the moisture that's going to be coming in here next is going to be water treated with BTI. Alright everyone, I got a few things I got to take care of, putting away, cleaning up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go, really quick though, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated too. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.